Welcome to Club Book with Eduardo Porter. My name is Yelena Bailey, and I am a Minnesota-based writer, former professor, and public policy director, and I am your moderator for tonight's event. My interdisciplinary research explores the interplay of race, power, policy, and culture. And last year, I authored How the Streets Were Made, Housing Segregation and Black Life in America, which I'm thrilled to share, was recently named a finalist for the 2021 Minnesota Book Award. I'm also thrilled to be in conversation with Eduardo, as our interests and areas of inquiry overlap greatly. Before I introduce our guest properly, though, allow me a moment to tell you a bit about the unique series that brings him to you tonight. Club Book is a program of MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, made possible through Minnesota's Art, Culture, and Cultural Heritage Fund, and coordinated by Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Scott County Library is a co-organizer of this evening's talk. If the pandemic had not forced a pivot to the virtual space, SCL would have been hosting Eduardo and all of you right now at their beautiful and homey public library in downtown Prior Lake. Thanks also to partnering bookseller Red Balloon Bookshop. A purchase link to American Poison, which I cannot recommend highly enough, and you'll hear more about that later tonight, will be available in the comments section of this live feed stream. You can have it shipped, you can pick it up at their lovely store in St. Paul, or you can have them deliver it to you personally at your door if you're in the area. One final housekeeping note, also in the comments, you'll see a survey link. MELSA would greatly appreciate hearing what you think of tonight's Club Book program. It's a quick and easy survey, so we encourage you to take the time to do it. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's author. Eduardo Porter is an economics reporter for the New York Times. His distinguished career in journalism has taken him to Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, and many points in between. He currently co-hosts The Pie, a podcast on pandemic economics sponsored by the University of Chicago, which explores the financial and social ramifications of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Porter is also the author of The Price of Everything, Solving the Mystery of Why We Pay What We Do, a revealing look at the cost-benefit analysis that underpin each and every human behavior. His latest book is American Poison, How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise. In a sterling review, Booklist says that with a scintillating rhythm and pointed language, Porter exposes all the ways in which racism has infected everything from unions to welfare to education and immigration policy. American Poison is a work for our times. It was reissued recently in paperback form on February 9th. After a short presentation and reading by our guest, actually I think we might skip that reading part, we'll have time for audience Q&A. So simply drop your questions in the comments thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. If you'd prefer to ask a query in a bit more anonymous way, you can also send a private message to the Club Book here on Facebook, or you can send an email to clubbookmn@gmail.com. So, time to dive in. This is such a timely work, a timely book, and I can't say just how much I enjoyed reading it. I'm looking forward to discussing. But to get us started, Eduardo, can you share maybe just a little bit about how your book speaks to our current moment and political climate?
Hi, Yelena. Thank you for such a lovely introduction. And hi, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to come and hear a little bit about American Poison. A lot has happened since American Poison came out about a year ago. But the central thought animating this book hasn't really changed. If anything, our dramatic last year suggested the racial hostility that has deformed our social contract since the birth of the nation, which is what I discuss in this book, is also going to determine our future. So Donald Trump lost the election in November, but our politics remains largely shaped by the same forces that brought him to power. The grievance of white voters resisting tooth and nail the emergence of a non-white America. As the nation becomes browner with each passing year, white sense of dread over their demographic future will increase the importance of race as a political force, and that will deepen the nation's divides. So I didn't set out, when I was thinking about this book, I didn't set out to write about race. I originally thought that I would write a book about why the richest and most innovative country in the history of the world, the United States, doesn't really behave like one. You know, 16 million Americans live below 1/2 of the poverty line. That's 6 million more than half a century ago. Whether it's the incidence of diabetes and obesity, the death rate from parasites and other infections, years lost to premature death, the United States is considerably less healthy than its peers in the developed world. Our life expectancy is shorter, our infant and maternal mortality rates are higher. We like to blame globalization and technological change for these misfortunes. You know the story that robots took our jobs. But that doesn't really fit, because globalization and technology struck everybody, including the French and the Canadians and the Germans and the Japanese. But American society, its hospitals and its schools, its roads and its middle-class homes, buckled alone. Now, how come? Because the United States just didn't show an interest in building the kind of safety net that other rich countries erected to protect those on the wrong side of the wrenching change that globalization brought about. So when the good jobs wither and the wages stagnated, the bedraggled, threadbare American safety net could not hold the line. America's dead babies and bloated prisons, its idle men and its impoverished single moms can all be traced to this exceptional fact. So then, to what led me to write this book was that I understood that we failed to build these things because racism got in the way. White voters, those with the political power to determine our future, refused to build universal health insurance, robust unemployment insurance, or universal childcare because they didn't want to share this kind of public infrastructure with the Black and the brown. They chose to leave those sinking to sink because many of those sinking were people of color. If public goods must be shared across lines of race and ethnicity, they would rather not have them. So I guess to push this forward, the question right now is, can we achieve a different, maybe more generous social contract? I don't think it's impossible. I mean, the United States population itself is changing, blurring racial boundaries. You know, the Black-white divide that has largely defined America's race relations is giving way to a kind of more diverse set of ethnic possibilities. And as America's kind of multiracial cauldron acquires more, different people, mostly through the growth of Asian and Hispanic populations, it's not unreasonable to hope that the racial hostility standing in the way of solidarity might lose some of its immense power. Maybe new generations will enlarge our understanding of what it means to be a mainstream American, close the chasm between the us and the other that has prevented the United States from becoming a nation offering equal opportunity to all. There are, in fact, moments in our history, Brown versus Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, where we have shown that we are capable of such change. The immediate prospects, however, at least, from my vantage point looking out my window, aren't great. Because it looks, from my perspective, that we are marching into the future more divided than we have been in a very, very long time. Race shapes our political divide. 57% of Republican voters are whites without a college degree. Only 17% are non-white, according to exit polls. Democrats have lost the white vote nationwide in presidential elections since the mid-1970s. What's more, race colors a chasm between our past and our future, between an ethnically and culturally diverse urban America, home to most of its population, its innovation, its economic might, and an older, overwhelmingly white, rural and small town nation that, despite its shrinking population and economic footprint, holds enormous political power. Race pretty much determines perceptions about the nature of the American challenge. You know, the typical African-American household, even today, 50 years after civil rights, makes only about 60% of what the typical white household takes in. The share of Blacks in poverty is twice the share of whites. 70% of whites think that discrimination is partly to blame, but only 36% of whites agree, only half the share. 9 in 10 Blacks say that the United States has not made enough progress towards racial equality. Hardly a crazy thought given the statistics I just referred to. 2/3 of African Americans are skeptical that the country ever will attain such equality. But white Americans, on the other hand, think the United States has done more than enough to expiate the sin of slavery. 8 in 10 white Republicans say that people seeing discrimination where it does not exist is a bigger problem than people not acknowledging real discrimination. See, white Americans, in fact, see themselves not as perpetrators of racial subjugation, but as victims of a misguided campaign to redress some overstated racial wrong. 4 in 10 African Americans say their Blackness has stood in the way of their success. But if you ask whites that haven't a high school diploma, 3/4 say their race has not provided any advantages. So given this big gap in views, it's not surprising that whites and people of color would disagree on what the government should do to heal the nation's ills. Almost 2/3 of white Americans would like the government, in fact, to be smaller, raising fewer tax revenues and providing fewer services. But by contrast, 6 out of 10 African Americans and 7 out of 10 Latinos would prefer the government to be bigger. In 2016, only 28% of white respondents told Gallup pollsters that the government should play a major role in improving the social and economic status of Blacks and other minorities. So again, it's the same story. We don't build public goods because we do not want to share them across lines of race. So pushing it forward, thinking about our future. The Republican Party has become a vehicle for the political expression of white anxiety over demographic change. And the Democratic Party, on its side, has all but given up its traditional alliance with working class white men. This kind of racial sorting has reshaped politics into an existential battle between 2 radically distinct forces that offers very little space for compromise. Donald Trump didn't build America's racial divide. But the flip side of this is that his departure from office will not diminish the power of racial animus in our politics. The capital question we face is whether our high-tech, postmodern future might yield some store of solidarity to overcome a racial wall built, bolstered, and refurbished over 250 years. And my guess, looking out the window into the first few weeks of the Biden administration, past an assault by mostly white marauders on the Capitol, past an impeachment process that demonstrated the fealty of the Republican Party to a proud racist leader, is that it won't. Indeed, my guess is that white voters trying to stop at all costs the rise of non-white voters to power will continue to determine the course of American politics for the next 20, 30 years. We might one day overcome our understanding of America as inextricably divided by race and ethnicity. We might come to redefine the notion of what a mainstream American is to include all of us. Between now and then, though, it looks like American politics will be consumed by whites doing their utmost to prevent this transformation. And if you ask me, it's going to be pretty hostile. So anyway, with that happy thought, I turn it over to you, Yelena. And hopefully we can get a good conversation going on.
Thank you so much for that. And for those in attendance or watching this, I think your introduction helps frame, to me, what's so incredible about this book is that so many people have been trying to make sense of the last 4 years and figure out, was this a blip on the radar? Is this a moment of regression? And your book provides some of what you shared, all this history and statistics and personal stories of towns that really gives us a long view of how we got there and why we haven't moved on yet, and what it would take to change things. So that was such a wonderful introduction. I hope for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, I feel like that will give them enough to jump in and want to get into it. So I like to start, I want to dig into some of the themes and things you shared. But before we dig into some of that, I always like to start with just some questions or a conversation about your approach as an author, right? This is something I'm always thinking about as a writer myself. I think one of the strengths of this book that people, will enjoy, have enjoyed, is it's such an engaging and accessible book, right? But as a researcher and, scholar, I appreciate it is well researched, and you're citing, history and political science and economists. So can you share a little bit about kind of your approach to this and how you managed to pull that off? And maybe kind of how your background has shaped, your approach to the book.
Well, my day job, writing for the Times, is a lot about, looking at research and trying to find out what people that are much smarter than I am have found out, have figured out, or about how the world works. So I write mostly about economics, so I tend to be more familiar with economics literature. But I'm interested in also what sociology and political science and social psychology has to say about how the world works. It's kind of like what I do every day. So there's this aspect of relying on research that came very natural to me. Now, how I decided to deploy it here is kind of like a weird fusion of that kind of like professional sort of bias that I have, just reading the papers and being interested in figuring out what they mean, is that I felt a bit of a close relationship to this topic. And I've lived outside of the United States since I was very young, and I only returned 20 years ago. And I remember having this feeling that this country was weird in that it was so rich, but at the same time so poor. I really had a hard time getting my head around that. There was so much violence and dysfunction and marginalization in a country that, gosh, it's like amazingly prosperous. And that idea just really kind of never left me. And I lived in LA for a few years soon after I arrived in the US. And in LA, you could see LA is a very kind of like multicultural, multi-ethnic, multinational place that is also very balkanized. I mean, you have the Mexicans living over here and the Koreans living over here and the Salvadorians living over here and the African Americans living over there and the whites living over there. It's totally separated. And so this idea started growing on me since then about what is it about this kind of balkanization of our society that contributes to this, kind of poverty in our public institutions. And I've been chewing on that for a really, really long time. And, and I guess the arc kind of came all the way down during the 2016 election, when I was kind of like stunned to see a guy became president based on a very overt, blatant, xenophobic, racist message that, this is the 21st century, right? This is, post-globalization, where, it's a cosmopolitan world. And I kind of connected this thing, I think this sense of us versus them, this tribal identity that is kind of like feels entrenched and aggrieved, is really a driving force of the American experience. And so anyhow, I kind of like try to get the skills from my day job with a little bit of my own personal thoughts and experience, and, kind of like put them together into a soup. And this is kind of what I got out of it.
I love how, casual you are about pulling off this great interdisciplinary, very accessible book. I'm telling you, there are many, I think, academics that would kill to have that skill set that you have. So congratulations on pulling that off. It is, for those who haven't read yet, it really, it's amazing how you managed to pull all that together. So digging a little bit into some of the ideas, I think I'm going to ask you this question. You mentioned in the book, and I found this intriguing and important to discuss, that group of kind of white writers voters that you talk about, don't need to, you said voters don't need to experience minorities to mistrust them, right? And I thought that was a very important and kind of poignant, statement, right? So I wonder if you can elaborate on how just even the perception of groups of people of color can drive these political and economic decisions.
Yeah, I think that minorities, people of color, immigrants, Muslims, the other, is a concept. It doesn't have to be a reality to motivate political thought. And I think that the moment that I kind of came face to face with this most blatantly is I went to Harlan, Kentucky, which is in Appalachia. It is an extremely poor county, heavily reliant on coal. I went there because it is one of like 10 counties in the United States where the federal government accounts for more than half of the income of its resident on average. So if you're the average Harlan resident draws at least half of its revenue in from, Social Security, food stamps, some sort of, federal government program. And they hate the feds. They hate the idea of welfare. And I was at a town hall where the then governor, a guy named Matt Bevin, who was a big Tea Party guy, was, he was riling up the crowd and whatnot. And the moment that he mentioned Medicaid being abused by, kind of like lazy people, he got a standing ovation. And I was sitting there looking at there and thinking, probably more than half the people here rely on Medicaid. And, digging into that, having conversations with some of the folks there, the notion that there's some other that is abusing the system, taking my taxes, somehow unfairly profiting, is very, very strong. And you don't even have to see the other. Harlan is, I'm going to guess here, but I'm not going to be off by a lot, 98.7% non-Hispanic white. So it's not like they see many people of color. But there is this kind of like inbred mistrust, and that's a mistrust that has been built into the political discourse for 50 years. I mean, it's been part of the arguments that have been made to undermine the social safety net since the Reagan years, or even before, since Richard Nixon. And it is super, super powerful. In fact, I mean, there's some polling, and I might mischaracterize this a little bit, but there was polling after the 2016 election that found that places where there were lots of migrants actually responded less well to Donald Trump's anti-migrant, and I'm thinking of just white voters. White voters in immigrant-heavy places were much less likely to respond to the anti-immigrant rhetoric than places where there were none. And so it's these things are symbolic, really. And I think that's how they have been nurtured in our political discourse.
That leads me to another question, and you touched on it a little bit, but one of the things you really get at in the book, especially through all the kind of history and your discussion of the social safety net, is that this isn't solely kind of a product of Republican thinking. I think there's a place where you say it's a mistake to see the racialization of welfare as exclusively the product of Republican thinking. And you give some good examples in the book, but I wonder if you might just walk us through, how is this kind of an American thing rather than one party? Yeah.
I mean, just to take one little step back, I think that today, 2021, there has been a kind of like sorting of our politics, which has led kind of like the racially hostile, the more tribal part of our white population into the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party has become the party of this new, multi-racial, multi-ethnic population. I do think that's a process that has pretty much run its course. In fact, I think, but in the history of the United States, this race and racial animus has been bipartisan. I start the book. I mean, the story of racial hostility in the United States is older, but I roughly start the book with the New Deal in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, this New Deal, which kind of like, I start there because the New Deal is a moment that kind of starts that the construction of the American social safety net. We didn't really have much of anything before then. And FDR kind of like massively expands it, and that sets the United States on a course that might have turned us into a social democracy, not unlike some countries in Europe. But at every step of the way, you see Roosevelt kind of like limiting it to whites. And one of the reasons is because he needed approval in the Senate. I don't think Roosevelt personally was racist, but he needed approval in the Senate. And the Senate, that meant that he needed the approval of Southern white Democrats, because, the Senate, the South, the Democrats control the South politically. And so to get the approval of Southern white Democrats in the Senate, he basically needed to exclude Blacks from the programs. And that's one of the reasons that the Blacks are not part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, because they are mostly in occupations like in agriculture and homework, and that were excluded. That's also why they were excluded from the first shot at Social Security. That's why so many of the government employment programs were segregated by race. I mean, and this is a Republican president negotiating with a Democratic president negotiating with a Democratic Congress, the Democratic Senate. And then if you move that, and it's not just, the Democrats were racist back in the past, even in the relatively recent past, the Clinton administration, and again, I would in no way accuse Bill Clinton of being racist, but he passed some of the most horrible criminal justice legislation that ended in the massive incarceration of African Americans. He also passed a welfare reform program that that I think was racist in motivation, that basically eliminated the poor's kind of like entitlement to assistance from the federal government, and replaced it with a program that was controlled by the states, which of course means that in southern states, the poor would get very little or nothing. So this kind of shrinking of the generosity of the state and this kind of adoption of punitive policies that happened to be particularly damaging to African American families and communities is something that has been done by Republicans and Democrats until actually quite recently.
Thank you. That was helpful. I love, especially because you dug into some of that history, not just like you said, way back, you know, a ton of easier to write off some of that New Deal stuff. Yeah. But you know, the 90s were extremely significant time in even some of the language around super predators and the policies that, you know, resulted in mass incarceration. So I appreciated that you didn't avoid that tough topic, which some folks kind of, you know, want to tiptoe around it. So I think at this point, I have more questions, but we're already getting some audience questions in, so I won't be selfish. I will ask you a few of those, and then, you know, if things slow down, I might slip in a few more of my questions in there.
Okay.
So the first one is actually something I wondered about as well is, you know, with everything going on with the pandemic over the past year, you know, how has either that shaped, you know, your understanding of the role of racism in politics, or, you know, someone asked, how has that maybe exacerbated class and racial tensions? So really just, you know, how's the pandemic play into all of this really?
I guess one of the things that I've remarked upon in this pandemic is I'm kind of surprised that people are surprised that this pandemic has had such a disproportionate impact on people of color. I mean, as we now all know, the infection rate and the death rate amongst people of color has been much, much higher than among white people. The economic impact from the kind of like the incredible recession that we're going into has also particularly impacted people of color. But the thing is that this is all kind of like, yeah, duh, that's how our country works. And so suddenly all this attention to, oh my God, look at what's happening. I'm saying, like, where have you been living? Because I mean, yeah, the people of color hold the jobs, these low-end service jobs that are the ones that are going to expose you more to the disease. You know, and are also the ones that they're going to lay you off more. Like if you worked you were a busboy at a restaurant, or, you know, they're the most vulnerable part of the economy. And you're also probably going to live in more difficult living conditions with, you know, more people, you know, scrunched up with your family, and you are less likely to have health insurance. And, you know, yeah, that's, you know, when I talked about at the beginning of this conversation, I talked about, you know, our high infant mortality, our low life expectancy. Well, yeah, duh, it's something that's happening mostly to underprivileged Americans, and underprivileged Americans are more likely to be people of color. And so this crisis, if anything, is just kind of like put the yellow marker on the, you know, we are an extremely unequal society. And we are amazingly kind of like indifferent to this inequality. And that what wraps it into my thinking is, yeah, one of the reasons that we are so indifferent to it is because it's happening to others, you know, others in the sense that they're Black or brown or, you know, Muslim. And so to me, you know, it's not like this pandemic created new inequalities, but it just really kind of like hammered on the inequalities that we have that are just kind of like so blatant and intense.
No, that helps. And I think, again, for those watching, something I appreciate about your book is for a lot of people who, aren't familiar with some of the history, they're looking at our moment and wondering, well, if there was ever a time, with all the unemployment and, the pandemic and all of this, if there was ever a time that we were going to embrace, universal health coverage or basic income or anything like that, this would be it. But I think your book gives us a framework of why that isn't what's happening, right? And to see kind of how we got to where we are, which, again, I really think this is timely for answering some of those questions of people who are trying to figure out, this did not shake out how I expected it to shake out, right?
Although, look, to be fair, I do think that, when Congress passed a $2.3 trillion assistance program last year, that did bowl me over, because it's like, we've never, ever done anything at that scale. Remember in 2009, Obama's just been elected president. He's crafting this, kind of like recovery act to build us out of the greatest recession since the Great Depression. And he can't get a package over 1 trillion passed in Congress. He made sure it was less than 1 trillion. And still, he did not get a single, not one Republican vote. Fast forward to last year, and suddenly we had this bipartisan package that was more than 2 times as big. It's like, what? And so, it's hard for me to interpret that within the framework of my thinking, because then we pass a 900 billion one at the end of the year, but I kind of think that is like our politics went a little haywire, a little crazy because of the pandemic. And right now they're kind of like settling back into the norm, because now you have President Biden is proposing another big package, 1.9 trillion. But now the arguments that are very often heard from the right, it's too much money. We are, going to indebt our kids if we have spent so much money right now. They're all coming out of the woodwork. So now we're kind of getting back to the norm. Why are we spending so much to help poor people? That argument is back with us.
I won't get off, but there's so much that I think you're saying that explains a lot of those debates around types of public good and relief right now. But I won't be selfish. I will ask another audience question. So someone else asked, if we step back kind of process-wise, one, if you could talk about the title. They were intrigued by the title of the book, and how you came to that title. And then also, was it hard? What was the process of kind of pitching the book, getting it picked up? Was it difficult? Because, it is a pretty poignant critique of our society. So yeah, those are the 2 questions.
Okay. So let me start with the second first. So pitching it was difficult because I didn't really know what it was for a while. I was talking to my editor at Knopf, really wanted me to write a book. And so I was going into these conversations with him about what book I wanted to write. And as I mentioned earlier, I was thinking about something very different at the beginning. It was more kind of like, why? How can the US behave this way? And it took me some time to say, well, actually, the better book is to look at the reason. The reason is race. And, there are other books about why the US is this way. There's a very famous book called What's the Matter with Kansas by a writer called Thomas Frank. It was published, I don't know, maybe 15 years ago, where he argued that whites voted against their self-interest for Republicans that cut taxes and cut public programs because they were motivated by things like guns and gender issues, gay marriage, stuff like that. And I remember that my thought was, no, that's, I can see that somehow, but you're really missing the big cleavage in American society. The big cleavage in American society is not guns. It's not, bathroom labels for gender. you kidding me? It's race. And so it took me a while as I was thinking through this process to kind of like think, okay, that's what I have to put on the front. That has to be my first sentence. And so that took me a little while. Once I came up with that, my publisher was really happy to run it. And the editing process was a dream. He was super helpful, and I had no problem with this proposal, with this thesis. About the title, I knew the title even before I knew the book. Because I guess it's because of the nature of how I came to it, which is my first thought was, how did America become such a crappy country when it's so rich? And well, so it's basically what poisoned it society, what stopped it, what got in the way, and so American poison was just like doom. It was there. It was the word. And I mean, I had a little bit more of an issue. It was a little bit more complicated to come up with a subtitle, which is How Racial Hostility Destroyed Our Promise. At one point, I was going to use How Racism Destroyed Our Promise. But I was thinking that the thought that I'm having about racial barriers, about tribal barriers, I mean, racism is, of course, a very prominent part of this, but there's also thoughts about, racial fear of loss of status vis-a-vis a growing other in our population. It seemed to me that there were a lot of emotions in the kind of tribal boundaries that I think are the core of the problem, that I thought that the word racism would be perhaps too reductive. And so, even though racial hostility sounds like a little bit of a wishy-washy sort of word, that's where we ended up.
Awesome. Key thing there is having a great editor, it sounds like.
It's very good.
For those when they're not writing, yes, that's a huge difference. Okay, two more have come in that I want to make sure I get in here. The first is, and you talk about this somewhat in the book, so maybe a snippet here of, are there other kind of state powers or governments that you see as maybe particularly progressive or regressive? Or do you see any of them being kind of a model for, what the U.S. could work towards?
I guess the short answer is no. And I think there are a bunch of rich countries that I think have built much more reasonable, effective, compassionate social safety nets, that have established social contracts that are much better for their people than we have. But I think that one of the people talk about Scandinavia, wasn't Bernie's favorite country Denmark? And a lot of these countries are much, much more racially homogeneous than we are. And so these guys, you have a bunch of tall, blonde, blue-eyed Swedes building universal health insurance for a bunch of tall, blonde, blue-eyed Swedes. And so this issue of these kind of us versus them sort of political rhetoric that has been so important in the building of our American society and our institutions hasn't really, or at least not until kind of recently, has not been present in these places. And in fact, as immigration to some of these countries from the Middle East and Northern Africa has increased, you start seeing some of the rhetoric that was more common in the United States in the 80s taking hold in some of these supposedly, social democratic, paradises. And so if anything, I feel that as diversity increases in these places, the challenge is for them to hold the line on the generous social safety net and not fall victim of this, I don't want to pay for something that's going to be for somebody else. That is such important, that's so critical in the development of the United States.
It sounds like, right now in our moment, more the concern is that they don't emulate us,
Exactly. Exactly. The fear is that they're coming our way. I'd love it if it were the other way around, but yeah.
I appreciate that as someone who, my dad immigrated here and always talks about how I wanted to go to Norway, but like, when you're getting a visa as a refugee, you end up where you end up. And he's like, I ended up here. But sometimes I'm like, that wouldn't have, I don't think that would have been the answer either. The next question is, can you maybe help the audience think through or share a little bit on how much maybe we can expect the government to address systemic racism? And they brought up particularly kind of, the history of, reparations and Reconstruction. Yeah, I'll leave it open to that.
This is a really, really difficult question.
I'm glad you have to answer it and not me.
And I struggle with the prescriptions. What is the best? What are the policies? My kind of like 10,000-foot take is that the goal is really to build a common sense of identity, an American sense of identity, one in where the, people in Appalachia and, and African Americans in Georgia and Latinos in LA feel equally American and feel comfortable with that identity. And that we can therefore build the public structures of society, including all the supports that are needed from people that fall out of, for whatever reason. In comfort that we're all kind of Americans. Kind of like this whole myth of the melting pot becoming real would be my sort of, and I know it sounds kumbaya and whatnot, but I do think that is a necessary condition to build. And in the book, I'm actually I push back a little bit against the notion that our challenge should be approached from the concept of justice. The fact that African Americans have been injusticed for hundreds of years and deprived of their rights and killed and, and deprived of their homes and their wealth. That is all true. But I layer that onto the politics of our present, and I wonder, okay, do we achieve this world that I think we need to achieve by solving this injustice, by reparations, for instance? And I have a hard time thinking that takes us where I think we need to go. So, I mean, to give it you in a very, very, cookie cutter version is go and ask the 75 million folks that voted for Donald Trump last year and say, part of what we're going to do now is reparations. And just what does that do to our politics? Now, I understand. I mean, in a way, it's kind of crazy that you think that this is the test that I'm putting the policy through. Oh yeah, we've got to ask the white guys, and it is crazy. It is crazy. But the America that I think that we need to build includes all those white guys. And you have to build it with all those white guys and all the, Latino guys and the African American guys and the Asian American guys. And so my thought about the argument from justice, true as it is, ineffable as it is from a kind of like if I'm thinking about where do we have to go, I don't think that is the main, that productive a strategy. Now, then you'll ask me, okay, so what's the project, what's the good strategy, and there I kind of like, I claudicate. I say, well, who know? I don't know. But because in fact, the fact that 75 million people could vote for a platform that was so divisive and so xenophobic and so racist kind of like saying, gosh, how do you fix that? And it leaves me sort of speechless in a way, you know? And then I come up with, I can tell, I mean, if I want to feel good, I feel, okay, we've done things. We've done things in our past. We've done school desegregation did happen to some extent, and it was very successful by some measures. Residential desegregation did happen to some extent. We did, problem is we stopped doing some of these things that were very successful, and I thought the conversation between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in the primaries, I don't know if you remember when she reminded him that he in fact voted against busing. I thought that was like, that was really going to stick with me because busing was an immensely successful policy. If you look at outcomes, educational outcomes, and there's work saying that these educational outcomes stayed later in life, and we stopped trying. So if you ask me, what do we have to do? My argument would be we have to double down on these kind of efforts that we have made to try to bring us closer together. So I think it's about residential segregation. I think we have to do policies to combat that, to bring residential integration, educational integration. And these are probably not even federal policies. It's more about state, municipal, local policy. It has to, but they have to serve, in my mind, the idea of building a community of all of us. And I'm even a little bit embarrassed even as I say this, because I tend to be kind of like a hard-nosed econ dude. And so this stuff about, but I can't see a way without that. I can't see that without building this sense of community, and we can do it.
That helps. And it kind of leads into someone else's question, but I just, from what I hear from you and what I gather from the book, it seems like there's a difference between saying like, yes, of course, justice is important and the argument makes sense, but we know change has to be structural, like you said, desegregation and things like that, but we haven't gotten there and won't get there until there's a collective investment. And that's where we have to deal with the nitty gritty of collective means, the people who are feeling hostile towards immigrants, people who just got here, and somehow we have to figure out what that looks like to collectively, have a shared investment in the public good, which is no easy feat. But someone asked, this question related to that is, do you think kind of the shifting demographics will affect that? And you talked about this a little bit. So maybe you want to speak on that?
That's another really tough and super interesting one, because so let's just look at what we know about the shifting demographics. By somewhere in the mid 2040s, the majority of the population will be non-white. And so this will, I think, naturally, I don't know when, but will tip the balance of political power. How it will tip it is, that raises a bunch of questions. Is there such a thing as a community of color that will then be the main political power in this country that will determine priorities in a different way? It's not clear to me, because the community of color is a bunch of different people with different cultural backgrounds and, and different experiences of this country. So, will African Americans and Latino Americans and Asian Americans coalesce into kind of like something that has some political coherence? Is not obvious. There's a chapter in the book about Southern California in where I kind of point out that in communities where there's been African Americans and Latinos, there's been a lot of tension between these communities too. And again, it's the same kind of like tribal feeling. It's, I want political power, resources and stuff for my people. And the way that you define the frontier between me and you is often, race, language, religion, these barriers. And so, I mean, I've read sociologists saying, okay, one question is whether this country is going to divide into white versus non-white or into black versus non-black. Could Latinos, then become whites? And this has happened in the past. I mean, if you look at the Northeast, Italians, Central Europeans, Jews, were kind of like blacks in the late 19th century, 20th century. They were considered inferior citizens. And over, like the early decades of the 20th century, they became kind of whitened. And one of the reasons they became whitened was the great migration of African Americans out of the South and into the Northeast. And so that kind of like led there's this, even more other population. So we'll invite these guys that are a little bit more like us, and so that whitened, the former the former others, the former inferior others. And could that happen again? It's hard to tell. I mean, right now, if you look at the lived experience of this country, of African Americans and Latino communities, I would say there's a lot of kind of like a lot of overlap, a lot of similarities, and the possibility of building a kind of like a shared understanding of what needs to be done. But the Rio Grande Valley Latinos voted for Trump at a much higher rate than they had in 2016, just last November, which was kind of like startling to everybody. And so it really, really is a big mystery. And then, you have also Asian Americans, which are, I mean, the two big growing populations are going to be Latinos and Asian Americans. And so how that's going to mix stuff up is super interesting, but very unclear.
Think we might have time for just one last question. Someone else asked again about your journey as a writer, and I think you've shared about that, but maybe as we're closing, advice to anybody interested in writing or any other kind of closing thought you want to share, I should say.
Gosh. Right. I mean, I've had a fairly, frankly, I've been really very lucky. I used to write I started as a writer in Spanish, writing for a Mexican newswire and then a magazine out of Brazil. And then I suddenly landed in the US to write for the Wall Street Journal. So which is like this huge, very big, and they decided to pay me to write in English. So I feel like, gosh, I really got lucky here. And then sort of like the Times said, gave me a job. And once you work for the Times, if you want to convince a publisher to publish your book, you're kind of like 3 steps ahead of everybody else, right? Because, you have that stamp on your passport. And so I think I'm kind of like, I've been more privileged in that way than a lot of other journalists and writers. But I mean, what do you just, if something is really burning, you write it. I think that's got to be it. Because here's the thing, being a writer is not going to make you a lot of money. Just, get that, understand that, I mean, there are, I guess, the 1%ers of the Writers Club, but pretty much it's not going to make any money. So if it burns you, write it. And if not, find a different kind of job, because that it'll be, because if writing, it's only about how much passion the writing instills, how passionate you feel about what you're writing. Otherwise, just do something else.
I appreciate that. I think that is a good, both encouraging and realistic note to end on, which seems like our conversation for tonight. So that's unfortunately all we have time for this evening, but thank you again, Eduardo, for fitting us into your busy spring schedule and being here tonight.
Oh, thank you, Yelena. From the vast expanse of my living room, it's been lovely to be here with you guys. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. So this has been a virtual presentation of Club Book, a long-running literary series of MELSA, made possible by the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Special thanks again to Scott County Library for the part they played in bringing Eduardo to us tonight. Before you log off, please look for the Club Book survey link, which is in the comments and will be projected in place of my video momentarily. Lastly, please consider joining Club Book on Monday, March 1st for a talk with chart-topping novelist and book club favorite Lauren Fox. This one will be co-hosted by Anoka County Library, and as always, it's free. So they'll be right here on Facebook Live, and we hope you'll join. Have a great night, everyone.